Information discussed in this podcast may be sensitive in nature to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Georgia Nadine Kirk was suffering from a series of strokes from the years 2004 to 2010, maybe longer. Georgia, who just usually went by her middle name Nadine, was living in Bonanza, Oregon with her son Theodore. Theodore didn't work, and Nadine had supported him since 1980. In 2010, Nadine was 93 years old and struggling with her health, but she had Theodore there with her to help out. Theodore took care of her throughout her strokes and even kept a detailed calendar pertaining to his mother's health. That calendar would be a huge piece of evidence later on. In 2015, some concerned citizens called the Social Security Administration offices. They worried because they hadn't seen Nadine in a few years, and they thought that Theodore might have still been cashing her Social Security checks. In August of 2015, Social Security immediately stopped paying those payments as they couldn't locate Nadine. No one could. No one knew what happened to Nadine or where she even was. Where is Georgia Nadine Kirk? Hello, and welcome to the Where Are They podcast and a bonus episode that is a bit different. This case involves an elderly woman who has vanished, and while it is most likely that she is deceased, this woman needs to be found and given a proper burial and resting place. Now, I can't tell you much about Georgia Nadine Kirk. I'm not even sure of her exact birthday, but her birth year is most likely 1917. I do know she preferred to use her middle name, Nadine, so that is what I'll refer to her as here. Nadine had been living in Bonanza, Oregon with her son Theodore. Theodore hadn't worked since 1980, and Nadine was his main support system. I'm not sure if this was a case of Theodore couldn't work or he just didn't, but in any event, he was living with his mother on a piece of property in Bonanza, Oregon. Bonanza, Oregon is a small, very small farm town. The population in 2010 was just 415 people. This is definitely a town where almost everyone knows everyone. It's primarily known as a farming and ranching community, but a close-knit one. I was surprised at how many different events are held in Bonanza throughout the year. There is a definite sense of community here. Nadine and Theodore's home was in a very rural area on the outskirts of Bonanza, on Swan Drive. The area is so rural that the road is actually an unpaved dirt road with no Google Street View, and satellite imagery is limited. It looks wooded and it looks sparse. There are a handful of houses on this street, but they do look to be separated, usually by patches of trees, and not very close together. It was said that Nadine and Theodore's property was very cluttered as well, with as many as 20 junk vehicles on their property. In 2015, some neighbors started talking. Something had tipped them off to the fact that Theodore was likely living off of his mother's Social Security still. They realized that none of them had seen Nadine in years. One of them would make a call to the Social Security Administration, who would now have to investigate. A representative went to the home to question Theodore. He told them that his mom had left the month prior to go stay with a friend in California. Eventually named that friend as Elsa Neiman. Now the authorities were involved and they went searching. And it turned out Elsa had actually passed away in 2013, a full 2 years earlier. Law enforcement now believed that Theodore was lying about his mother, and it was quite possible that she was deceased. Neighbors had now also come forward with reports of a foul odor on the property and seeing a large pile of lime at one point. Law enforcement requested to search the property, but Theodore continued to deny their requests. Theodore was finally arrested and charged with cashing his mother's Social Security checks. They tried to make a deal with him to find out where Nadine's body was and what happened to her, but Theodore wasn't talking. In the home, they found a very detailed calendar in which Theodore had made regular notes about his mother's well-being and health, including the series of strokes she had had from 2004 to 2010. The last notation on that calendar was in June of 2010. The last official record of Nadine doing anything in their joint banking account was January of 2010 when she signed a check. Detectives would also note that there were no health-related purchases for Nadine as there had been before. Looking through the bank records, they could tell there had been purchases of medicines, home care items, and other personal things that were clearly for Nadine. All of that stopped in 2010. The last piece of damning evidence came when the neighbors came forward and talked about yard sales that Theodore held at the property, specifically between 2013 and 2015. Sales in which he was selling an electric scooter that his mother had used, a walker, a wheelchair, and other items that had belonged to Nadine. But Theodore still wasn't talking. In 2018, Theodore was convicted for cashing his mother's Social Security checks, and he was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. He was scheduled to be released in 2020, but I haven't found any further information on him today. Theodore was 64 years old when he was sentenced, and he would likely today be around 70 years old. After Theodore's conviction, law enforcement took cadaver dogs out on the property, and they hit on a spot in the yard. Specifically, the same spot where neighbors had seen a large pile of lime years earlier. Finally, authorities thought they had gotten a break, and perhaps they have found Nadine. A thorough dig of that area in the property turned up no signs of Nadine, however. Law enforcement was baffled. They were certain that Nadine was likely buried on the property, and she still may be, but how come they couldn't find her anywhere? Have they just not looked in the right spot yet? And are they still looking? What happened to the property when Theodore went to prison? It's also unclear if Nadine had any other children. As I mentioned, there just isn't a lot of information about Nadine and her case. It made a little bit of noise locally, but that seems to be about it. I know there are other cases like this. An elderly person vanishes and no one really knows because their sole caretaker doesn't tell anyone, usually with the intent to continue cashing their Social Security checks or their retirement checks. It's a hard topic to research, and I'm sure that there are so many out there that we don't even know about. But they can't keep up the charade forever, can they? Eventually, the world will find out. You can't continue to cash these checks indefinitely, right? I've also seen cases where it's kind of a backward situation. The children have gone missing, but parents continue to collect benefits for them. Adam Herman was a foster child who was eventually adopted by the Hermans, but it would be years before he would be reported as missing because his family kept moving. He didn't attend school, and it wouldn't be until his biological sister tried to track him down as they were adults, and she realized she couldn't find him. The parents finally admitted that Adam had run away almost a decade earlier, but they continued to cash his benefit check they received for him from the state. We've also seen something like this in the Harmony Montgomery case. Kayla Montgomery was charged with collecting food stamp benefits for Harmony years after Harmony disappeared. A disappearance which would soon turn into a murder case. It's so tragic that these things can fly under the radar without anyone knowing. Georgia Nadine Kirk was last seen in 2010, but the exact timeline of her disappearance is unknown. Authorities learned of Nadine's disappearance in 2015, in which Nadine would have been 98 years old. Today, she would be 107 years old. At the time of her disappearance, Nadine is described as a Caucasian woman standing 5 foot tall and weighing around 110 pounds. She was elderly and not in the best health. She is described as having short gray hair and she wore glasses. It is not known exactly when Nadine was last seen. It's suspected to have been in the year 2010, also the year she likely disappeared. But again, we just don't know. Anyone with any information on what may have happened to Georgia Nadine Kirk is asked to contact the Klamath County Sheriff's Office at 541-883-8150. It is most likely that she is deceased, although we don't know if that was due to foul play or if maybe she died of natural causes and Theodore just covered up the death to keep collecting her benefits. I suppose both scenarios are just as likely. Or is it possible that there is another answer? Could something else have happened to Nadine? What do you think happened to Georgia Nadine Kirk? Should law enforcement continue their efforts to find answers and to find Nadine? Thank you so much for listening to Nadine's story today and for being a supporter of our show. If you have any case suggestions for me, be sure to send them my way either on social media or via email at canwefindthem@gmail.com. Let's keep sharing as many stories as we can. There are so many missing person cases out there, so many that need our attention. We will be back again very soon with another unsolved missing persons case. And until then, stay safe and hug your loved ones.